The first camera I ever bought was a Sony A57. I was going on a trip to Kenya and I didn't know what I was doing, so I just threw the camera right on auto. So in this video, I want to show you exactly how to set up your camera so you can get going with photography, because it's a lot simpler than you might think. So there are 3 camera settings that you have to juggle in order to determine how much light is hitting your camera sensor or how bright your image is. And those 3 camera settings are the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So let's start off with the setting that you're probably going to be changing the least, and that's the aperture. So if you want to know what to set your aperture to, look no further than the lens itself. Every lens should have a little number on the front or somewhere on the side of it that'll tell you how wide your aperture can go. And what your aperture does, it controls how much light is going into your camera. So the wider your aperture, the brighter your image is going to be. And then the tighter your aperture, then the darker your image is going to be. So on your camera, you can adjust the aperture with the f-stop, and that'll be on the bottom of your screen. And for mine, the widest I can make my aperture is f1.8, so that's what I'm going to keep it at. Typically, in most situations, you don't really need to change your f-stop because you want the most natural light to come in to hit your sensor as possible, so we're just going to set it and forget it. Next up is the shutter speed. So the shutter speed is arguably the hardest setting to nail down, and it's also the one that you have to be thinking about all the time. No matter what, I'm constantly thinking about the shutter speed and what I have to set it to. Here's a chart of some typical shutter speeds that you'll be setting your camera to. What you want to remember here is that the shutter speed controls how fast your photo is taken. So if I'm taking a picture of someone that's not moving, like a portrait, then I'll set my shutter speed to 1/200. If I'm taking pictures of something moving really fast, then I'll set my shutter to 1/500 or 1/640. Now, think about those 2 actions, and then everything else should fall in between. And that's where you can estimate your shutter speed. If I try to get away with putting the shutter speed pretty low, then I'm creating some motion blur in the image, which no one wants. You definitely want a nice crispy image. So once I've set my aperture and made it as wide as possible, and then I've determined how fast I think the scene is moving, then the last thing to change is the ISO. So the ISO is definitely the last thing that you want to change, because while it will make your image brighter, it'll also make your image grainier. So the lower that you have your ISO, the better your image will look. But you do have to set it to the proper ISO in order to make your image properly exposed. So to recap, we want to maximize the usefulness of our lens, and we want to use as wide of an aperture as possible, which also means I want the f-stop number to be very low. Then I want to determine how fast should I set my shutter speed to, depending on what's in front of me. And then the last thing that you'll just have to adjust is the ISO. What you might find out is that after you do those things, your image is still going to be too bright. And that's probably because you're taking a picture outside versus in a lower indoor light situation. So if you're in a situation where you're taking pictures outside, then what I would do is still set my aperture as wide as possible. I would put my ISO to 100, and then I would set my shutter speed to however fast I need it to go for the image to be properly exposed. It never hurts to put your shutter speed faster outside to make your image properly exposed. So maybe an easier way to describe all of this would be to set your aperture as wide as possible. Then I would do shutter speed and then ISO, versus if you're doing an outdoor scene, after you set your aperture, then I would set the ISO to 100, and then I would just adjust your shutter speed accordingly. And that's it. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this video. I'd appreciate it if you could say hi in the comments. Take these tips and take care.